All right, folks. So we are going to pick up where we left off last time in class. So as you know, I am not I'm not available. But we have to keep moving forward with our content. So that is why we are going to do this online lecture. Know too that that the content here will be on your next exam, and that you can use this for your discussion board posts. And that discussion board 3 is now live, and you should also have your other discussion boards graded. Please email me with questions, but know that as I'm out of the country, I will be delayed in my responses to you. So we covered this last time a little bit, but I want to go over it again really quickly. Remember that public opinion is important because a minimum requirement for a democratic government is that policies reflect the will of citizens. If we have situations where, in fact, policies do not reflect the will of citizens, then we may wonder about the efficacy of government as an institution. And the fact is that when we think about how politicians know what it is that citizens want, we can't expect them to ask all of us what we want at any given time. And that's just unreasonable from a practical point of view. And from a scientific point of view, it's not necessary. And we want to think about where public opinion originates and some of the basis of our public opinion attitudes that are reflected in polls and an aggregate level information. Because the fact of the matter is that, as we talked about in the first chapter of the class, and as we'll talk about again in this chapter, the fact is that citizens simply do not possess vast amounts of specific knowledge. They don't. They might not. There might not even be a reason for them to do it, because we can understand things about politics without knowing all the nitty-gritty details of every political issue. I happen to be a very knowledgeable person about politics because I'm a political scientist, and I love politics. I'm sort of a political junkie. I watch the news all the time. But it's equally likely that some of you may know as much about politics as I do, even though you may lack all the detailed, very specific knowledge that I have. You may be able to piece together information as well as I can in some circumstances because of the baseline level of knowledge you have. So, but in general, we do have a lot of Americans as well who have just absolutely no political knowledge, and that's a real problem. And we have to think about how that matters with regard to how public opinion is expressed. If people don't know what they're talking about, then all of a sudden we have serious issues when we want to think about how public attitudes are reflected in public opinion polls, and if those attitudes are in fact stable. We always want to be aware of the ecological fallacy. The ecological fallacy is, again, remember we talked about this in class, but the ecological fallacy is where you take an aggregate level expression and try to apply it to an individual. And similarly, if you are an individual and you try to apply an attitude to an aggregate phenomenon, both of those those circular logic scenarios are in fact logical fallacies, and we should always be aware of those, because if I tell you that some sector of the Democrats think X, that the majority of Democrats think X, and then you tell me you're a Democrat, I can't automatically infer that you, as a Democrat, believe what the majority of Democrats believe, because I don't know anything about you as an individual. I just know what Democrats in general think. And so to do that would be an ecological fallacy. You just have to be very careful about that. It's easy to do in public opinion, and it's done quite often. We see public opinion discussed in the media, but this is a real critical issue, the ecological fallacy. Watch out for it. Now, some definitions. Public opinion is defined as the values and attitudes the mass public has about issues, events, and personalities in the aggregate at a specific point in time. A couple of key things. Aggregate, specific point in time. It's an aggregate phenomenon, and it is temporally bound. And it's the mass public, right? So again, this is aggregate mass public. We're talking about these larger effects that make it very difficult because people are often very egotistical, right? Not in a negative sense. I'm just saying, like, I care about what I think because it's what I think, and it's what matters to me on a daily basis. How I go about the world is important to me, and what have you. And so when we try to take ourselves away from this sort of egocentric understanding of how people understand politics, it becomes difficult for some people. And so we just have to be aware of that. As long as you're aware of it, you're certainly entitled to your opinion, and you're certainly entitled to your attitudes and your values, but you have to be aware of others as well. And public opinion sort of gives us a sense about where the public is rather than our own sort of than yourself, right? So again, just think about the ecological fallacy. Now, values, or otherwise known as beliefs, are those basic orientations towards politics. And that gets us to your political ideology, because an ideology is, one hopes, a cohesive set of beliefs that form a philosophy about government or the way we should organize government or society. And an ideology is best understood as cohesive. The best ideologies are cohesive, and that's what we really, really want in a good ideology. This also becomes a problem if you have an incoherent ideology. Then it really becomes a question about whether or not you have an ideology at all, because if your attitudes are somewhat incoherent, then all of a sudden that throws into question the your entire structural view of politics, which is fine. You don't have to have a really firm ideology, but as you learn more about politics, often ideologies do become more cohesive. That brings us to attitudes, and attitudes are sort of the expression that we see. It is a specific view about a particular issue, personality, or event. So when we talk about, how do people feel about healthcare? That's an attitude. How do people care? How do people feel about gun control? That's an attitude. How do people feel about, do you approve or disapprove of the president's job? That's a job performance. That's an attitude about a specific issue, personality, or event, right? So attitudes change. Attitudes can evolve, and different attitude dimensions, or different attitude objects, as to say these issues, personalities, or events, can shift attitudes depending on context. That's important to recall as well. All right, so this gets into information. So how do we develop these values? Well, political socialization is really crucial in developing political values. So the process through which underlying political beliefs and values are formed is your socialization process. This happens mainly through your family. And the people who raise you and introduce you to politics. So when I use the word family, I don't mean mom, dad, or grandpa. It doesn't have to be related to you, but whoever it is who is influential in your life and developing your attitudes about politics, that's who I'm talking about here. And then that gets us to your underlying beliefs that then tend to shape how you approach new information. Your life experiences are crucial here. So you can be raised in a very conservative family and then have some sort of life experience on your own, or as a result of some sort of horrible situation that's befallen you, or something, and then that could change your attitudes, that could change your values about politics, or vice versa. You could be very liberal and have some sort of traumatic event or some sort of seminal event in your life that shapes the way you understand politics differently, and all of a sudden you evolve into someone who's very conservative, and that happens. But in general, what we find is that socialization from parental and other family influences are the most crucial, and generally partisanship and ideology flow from generation to generation, even though there's always the example of, well, my parents are conservative and I'm very liberal. Well, no doubt that happens, and vice versa. But in general, these things follow in a linear fashion from generation to generation, most of the time. And again, so these are some of the groups that and factors that may impact your political socialization: family, social groups, your education, your general political climate. So what we know is that kids who were going to school and sort of growing up in the tri-state area of Manhattan, New Jersey, Connecticut, that area, after 9/11 were traumatized, as you might imagine, in ways that have seriously affected their attitudes and beliefs relative to other people of their age cohort, which may include some of you, actually. So, and that is attributable in some ways to 9/11 or other things that happened in their life. I mean, surely we were all affected by 9/11, but you can imagine that if you had family or you yourself were living in the area or have been in an area where there was a significant traumatic political or social event of some sort, that has a serious impact on the way you develop politically, and we know that happens. So your values are what give you your ideology, and I apologize if I'm scooting through this with some speed. My hope is that if you want, you can stop and pause and reflect on some of these things, but I do want to, your time is precious, and I actually have a meeting in a few minutes, so I have to hurry this up. But anyway, so your values and ideology. So ideology, again, this is the set of underlying orientations, ideas, and beliefs about politics. So in America, in the American context, we often have liberalism and conservatism in the United States. And this puts us, these are the dominant ideologies, but they're not the only ones around. We usually think of this as a linear scale, and that's fine. Liberals are on the left, conservatives are on the right, and then in the middle, there are these great moderates that are out there. And, That's certainly true to some extent, but in some ways we have to really think about whether or not that reflects the wide range of ideologies. Political party and ideology are not necessarily synonymous, but increasingly it is the case. So once upon a time in American politics, you might have been able to be a liberal Republican or a conservative Democrat. The South was a solidly Democratic area of the country. Almost every member of Congress from the southern U.S. was a Democrat for a long time, and these people were extremely conservative. In fact, the fact of the matter is that many people who are Republicans now, their parents were Democrats, and they have not really changed. Their attitudes and opinions, their attitudes and beliefs about politics are largely the same writ large, but they've switched their partisanship because as the parties have become more homogeneous, that is to say, if you're a Republican, you are conservative. If you are a Democrat, you are liberal in general. Then people have had to switch their party allegiances. And that has become somewhat difficult for some people, and it's made party and ideology synonymous. And in our two-party system, which we'll talk more about when we get to elections and behavior and things like that, and the two-party system, again, that lends itself to really talking about these dominant ideologies of liberalism and conservatism, and defining what that means is somewhat nebulous, so we have to work on that. But polarization is the watchword these days. We're becoming more polarized as a public, but really, if you look at this, and if you care a lot about this, we'll talk a lot about this in my public opinion class, Political Science 403, but the big thing is that polarization is really an elite-driven process. The American public became polarized only after elites became extremely polarized, and reinforced this through several institutional choices they've made throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. Polarization became more generally demonstrated after that elite-driven process happened. And so we can always talk about how much we don't like elites, or elites are this, or elites are that. The fact is that much of our behavior, I should back up. Many of our attitudes are signaled by elites, and then partisans catch on to those signals, and those people are opinion leaders within our social networks. And then we watch those people, these political novices that we watch those people and say, well, if John, my very knowledgeable, politically involved friend, is becoming so much more liberal, then maybe I should be more liberal, or maybe he's becoming more conservative. Maybe Rebecca's becoming more conservatives, and I need to become more conservative too because I trust Rebecca. She knows what she's talking about. So, and then that's how it gets driven to the mass level, right? So it's an elite-driven process, but it's very common now. And the thing to remember always is that context is key at the individual level, but in the aggregate, we do see some basic trends on polarization. And again, we'll talk a lot more about this throughout this course, but I will leave this for another day. So what's this all about? We're really talking about liberty, order, and equality. When you think about your political values, you're really thinking about these three big ideas. So we've talked a lot about liberty, talked a lot about equality, order, and so democracy is a way to maintain order, right? So in our book, we talk a lot about liberty, equality, democracy, and that's just true. When you think about democracy is the way we ensure social order in the United States. And this is not to say this isn't controversial and that there aren't certainly things we could debate about with that, but fundamentally in the United States, we have, in general, a very stable government, a very stable civil society, and the result of that is a maintaining of order in general, and respect for law and order and things of that nature. And so when you think about your political values, you have to think about to what extent do you believe that the government should have more or less control over establishing liberty, order, and equality. And these three values are always in tension. There is no such thing. We're trying to find the Goldilocks zone here. Is the porridge too hot? Is the porridge too cold? Is the porridge just right? Not really sure. But the fact is that these values are always in tension. And our goal as citizens, and thus also the goal of the government by being our representatives and our attitudes and opinions, is to figure out the best way to organize these values so that we make sure to have a stable and successful society. And that's really where your ideology comes into play. So when we think about American politics, we really think about, two different dimensions in general. And this could be the political right or the political left. And but the truth is, and we don't talk about this enough probably, is that there's so much more to this, as I said a minute ago. And so on the political right, you really want to think about how the political left and political right organize themselves into these dimensions, right? So up here on this far left corner, we've got social liberty, economic equality. Far right corner, we've got far top right, we've got social order, economic liberty, and then below that we have social order, economic equality, and order, and then over here we have social equality and economic equality, right? And so what you see on the political right is that social order is a crucial aspect to this, like having some level of established order that is capable of really demonstrating that society is well organized. On the left, people are much more concerned in general about social liberty of some sort or another, or social equality at its most sort of extreme version. And so again, this is we're going to talk about the nuances here. This is a very complex discussion, so I do apologize that we don't get to have this discussion in class. But we can start to talk about this when we get back together. But the main thing to know is that these values, as you see, are always in tension with each other, and you can have more or less of them. These are continuums. These are not discrete values. These exist on continuums, and we have to think about it that way, which is complex and difficult, but that's where we are. So if you think about yourself as a moderate, you're going to be somewhere here. So moderates are right here in the middle. And our friends, the moderates, are traditionally in this sort of this area between want a little bit of everything. So social liberty, some social order, some economic equality, some economic liberty, a little bit of everything. It's like a nice little gumbo, right? And then generally in American politics, our dominant ideologies and partisanship attachments, party attachments, are here. So Democrats are liberal. They err on the side of a little more social liberty, economic equality. So same-sex marriage, cool beans. Legalize marijuana, cool. Economic equality. How do you ensure economic equality? Well, you might raise taxes on the rich to provide social programs and have a more robust public education system and more robust social services provided through public means. On the right, you would have conservatives. So conservatives will err a little bit more to social order. So and again, this goes back to if a conservative argument about same-sex marriage is neither here nor there per se. It's really what level of government is the level of government whose responsibility it is to make a decision on same-sex marriage, and then do we allow that level of government to do that? So this is arguments about states' rights, and that really goes to the social order. If you have a document like the Constitution that says that we have a 10th Amendment where we have reserved powers to the states, then that means the states have responsibilities, i.e. the right to decide who has a marriage is entitled to a marriage contract. And so this is why conservatives sort of err on the social order sense. And then economic liberty, lower taxes, lower regulations for your business climate, right? And so that's where we're getting with economic. So you have more freedom economically, whereas here we're looking to raise taxes a little bit on the Democratic side to provide more social programs. Here we lower taxes a bit to provide more economic liberty, and the idea that the rising tide will lift all boats. And so that's really the dominant ideologies in American politics. And it's fairly uncontroversial, I would say, but there's more to it. Our friends the libertarians, and some of you may feel like you're a libertarian, they sort of range the gamut here. They're on the right, they're on the left. Libertarians are all about economic liberty, low taxes, but they're also all about social liberty. So where they are, we don't know. They don't fit neatly in our two-party system on this ideological spectrum. As you see, the ideological spectrum I have is more like a donutty figure with a bite taken out of it. Imagine this doesn't exist. Imagine this is sort of a black hole. And so libertarians sort of go back and forth, and that's something to always consider. That's why people like Rand Paul, who's a senator from Kentucky, a big libertarian, he is, he won't vote for the Affordable Care Act repeal because it's not conservative enough. He won't vote for the tax reform bill because it actually doesn't lower taxes enough. And so he's a very conservative Republican, we think, but he really is as a libertarian. And so he has these very specific attitudes that are not being reflected in the dominant conservative policies that are being put forth, and he's letting it be known. And so then as you go a little farther down to the more extremes, you have these reactionary politics, right, on the right. So this is people like Ted Cruz and hit people who share his attitudes and values, which are people who would really like to go back. I call them reactionary. There's no better way to say it, but they're people who want to go back to some previous instance of American politics, want to go back to some previous social order. It's a much stronger social order orientation. Economic liberty is sort of wishy-washy. Yes, the economic liberty is there, but social order is what's important. So you do what you got to do with the economy to get social order serious, I guess is the best way to say it. On the other hand, social democrats are getting much closer to this total equality business down here, right? So these are people like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist. He is a caucuses with the Democratic Party. He's not a member of the Democratic Party right now, but he cares a lot about social equality, so same-sex marriage, legalizing marijuana and other drugs of that nature, and civil rights protections for minority populations and things like that. But also, he wants to raise taxes a lot and provide a lot more public goods. He thinks education is a total public good, so colleges should be free. And this gets you a lot more towards economic equality, because the way you pay for that is through taxation, and that's sort of equalizing economic outcomes in some ways that historically Americans have not been much in favor of overall, but at different times they've been looked at a little more favorably than they are right now. And then we finally get down here close to the black hole of nothingness, which I'll call anarchist. But then we have Marxist socialism and then fascism. So if you think back to World War II, Hitler and the fascists were just sort of who were these extreme right-wing governments, were extreme mortal enemies of the Marxist socialist Soviet Union. But if you look at the way they ordered their societies, they were extremely similar, right? They were both authoritarian, totalitarian states, quasi. You could debate about which one they were really, but the government had total control. So the government in a fascist state is total social order, and the only way you can do that is by having an extremely heavy-handed national government. But then also the fascists, any economic activity was done in service of social order. That's what they wanted. And so that's why Nazi Germany looked the way it did. On the other hand, Marxist, Socialist, Soviet Union, sort of these very sort of states that prize total equality, absolute total equality of outcome, they were very, I'm going to go back, sorry. They were very, very heavy-handed with their government as well in service of making sure that there was going to be a very clear equality of outcome for everyone, and to do that you had to have a heavy-handed government. But in the U.S., and then of course here we have our anarchists who don't want any kind of government, which, the absence of government is you have no social order, you have no social liberty, you have no equality, it's just nothingness. It's anarchy is a darkness that we can't contemplate because we live our lives and have been socialized to understand how to operate under government, and anarchy would be the opposite of all of that. And so everything you think you know about how to behave in a society would go out the window in anarchy until you decided at some level or another to organize yourself into another polity, whether that's your neighborhood or your family or something, and then you might sort of have to debate with this entire scale again on some, depending on the level of aggregation on some level or another, but anarchy would put an end to all of this. But in the United States, the Democratic Party sort of encompasses all of these people here. So you've got some people who are moderate, you've got some people who are social democrats, and you have people in the middle, libertarian-leaning Democrats, and so on and so forth. And similarly with the Republican Party, they are over here. The Republican Party has this sort of mainstream conservative Republican sort of heartbeat, but they have libertarians, they have reactionary politics like Ted Cruz, I would say. People here in the middle would be people like Jeff Flake, libertarians like Rand Paul. And then the question that I would like to pose to you and have you consider is, where in the world is President Donald J. Trump? I honestly don't know. I cannot tell you. Now, when we come back to class, we could talk more about why that is and what that means. But for now, we do see that in the mainstream of Democratic politics, in the Democratic Party, you've got Bernie Sanders down here. Hillary Clinton was very squarely in this blue box. You have more conservative Democrats like Steny Hoyer, who's a member of the House from Maryland, and people like that. But President Obama was, again, squarely in this blue box. John Kasich is in this red box for the Republicans. I mean, we could put all these people on this scale somewhere or on this dimensional chart. But the bottom line is that the most important thing to think about is that if you can't put a politician on here, like perhaps President Trump, then what is their ideology, and what do we know about what they think about politics? I'm just not sure. So these are some basic positions that Democrats may have. This, by the way, is Nancy Pelosi. She is the minority leader in the House right now. She was the former Speaker of the House for a few years there. First female Speaker of the House in U.S. history, by the way. But she's still in office. She's still in the leadership role for the Democratic Party. And so these are the basic positions that Democrats may have. They support abortion rights, support affirmative action, oppose prayer in public schools, bring into the war in Iraq. But I mean, this is sort of older at this point. But basically any war. And then Republicans. This is Paul Ryan, who is the current Speaker of the House. And these are basic orientations to politics that most Republicans have, and these are fairly conservative attitudes and values. So, again, the main thing here is that in the U.S. politics, because of our two-party system, there are dominant ideologies that we often think about. They're not the only games in town. And again, the reason that this is important is because these values are what shape your attitudes about politics. And when we get to attitudes, it's important to understand both what the basis of those attitudes are, bases of those attitudes, but also how we measure those attitudes, which is how we get to public opinion polls. So I'm going to take a short break right here. I encourage you to pause the video and pick it up again in a few minutes. Take a break, to get a stretch, get some water, and we'll come back together and discuss this further in a few minutes. All right, we're back. And so now we're going to talk about how to measure public opinion. And when you measure public opinion, you're really talking about polls. And so polling is important, and it's important to think about how this actually gets done. Polls get a bad name. Sometimes what we think are actually polls are not scientifically valid polls. So we have to be very, very precise about what we're talking about when we talk about public opinion polling. All scientifically valid public opinion poll is going to use a sample, a random sample from a larger population. So if you draw a circle, right, draw a piece of paper, draw a circle, and then put a bunch of dots in it, right? Dot, 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 dot. Everything inside that circle, all the dots you've just drawn, is your population. And if you want a scientifically valid public opinion survey, poll, what you want is a random sample of the dots within that population. You don't want to talk to every single person. It's impossible. There are 350 million Americans. I'm not sure if that's actually true. Maybe 320. There's a lot of Americans. Over 300 million people. We cannot talk to everybody in America. So if we want to get an estimate, polls are necessarily an estimate. It's necessarily there's always uncertainty built in. Then you have to take a sample of a population of interest. And this is called a probability sample. So theoretically, the probability of any one individual in your population being selected into your public opinion survey should be theoretically equal. If you don't do that, then you have what's called a convenience sample, and those are not scientifically valid. You can do some things with a convenience sample and have it be just fine. But if you're just doing standard polling questions, then this is not a scientifically valid way to do your work. So your population of interest is crucial. If you're thinking about politics, then you don't want to ask just every American, because people under the age of 18 can't vote. If you're thinking about elections specifically, then you want to think about, does everybody over the age of 18 vote? No, they don't. So you have to do the vote. You have to be registered. So then we decrease the population a little bit more. All right, so our population is actually registered voters. But are all registered voters who are necessarily American citizens over the age of 18, are all of those people going to vote? No. So if we want to get a really precise estimate on who might win an election, we might want to get a sample of likely voters. Right? And so this brings you further down the rabbit hole into this probability. So you're shrinking. You could draw concentric circles within that bigger circle that you have. And then finally you have your bullseye population, and you take a probability sample of those people to get your survey. And one of the ways we do that generally is through random digit dialing. So telephone surveys are still the gold standard of public opinion survey work. And random digit dialing is the way that works. So usually you contact a company and you buy a list of phone numbers from them. And so recently Dr. Aaron King here in the Department of Public International Affairs, and I did a quote for a survey of Wilmington. And if we wanted to get 1,200, and we'll talk about why that number is important, 1,000 to 1,200 respondents in the city of Wilmington, with 70% of those people being landlines, 30% being cell phones. I can talk about that in a minute as well. We would have to pay $9,000, and we would be getting 45,000 landline numbers, 45,000, and we would be getting 25,000 cell phone numbers. All of that to get a random sample of 1,000 to 1,200 respondents. That is how difficult it is to get people to answer surveys, and how large your sample needs to be to get enough completion so that you have a truly random sample. If you don't have a random sample, then you're inviting selection bias into your survey, and selection bias makes a survey invalid. The validity of your survey goes out the window, and you can't make any reasonable inferences from that survey at that time. This is something you want to avoid if you can. And selection bias is often problematic if you sample too many people of one race or one gender or one economic class, or anything you do that skews your results in a way that does not reflect the larger population is selection bias. And this is also the case. This is why for a poll to be scientifically valid, the survey interviewer must reach out to you, the interviewee, the subject. If you select into a poll, that is selection bias, because there are likely predictors that make you more or less probable to engage with a survey. And so anytime we have surveys that allow you to select in, let's just say every single poll you see on Twitter or a sidebar of a website, or vote for your favorite American Idol. American Idol is a self-selected, biased poll, right? When that show was on television, that's what it's just nonsense. You just vote 1,000 times for whoever you just, text. That's craziness. That's rife with selection bias. It's not scientifically valid. So another way that your selection can be biased is if you don't have the right sample size. So you want to make sure your sample size is between 1,000 to 1,200 respondents, and we'll talk about how that is more in a second on the next slide, but one more sec. And you're always dealing with a margin of error. Margin of error is basically the confidence interval for statistics. If you've ever taken a statistics class, then you know about confidence intervals, and this is all based on the normal distribution, which we'll see in a sec. But basically, your margin of error tells you the band within which your estimate may be truly in the population. So anytime you see a poll that says 47% of Americans think X, well, what that means is 47% of Americans think X plus or minus some percent. So it could be a little bit higher, could be a little bit lower. We don't know. So that's why margin of error is very important. But it does work best with some visuals. So this is one from the election last year that I wanted to talk about. Donald Trump, on the night after his first presidential debate, he tweeted this out to all of his followers. And I, of course, follow Donald Trump. I follow all major politicians on Twitter because, hey, why not? And I thought this was really instructive, because this is every single one of these so-called, and I will use scare quotes here, quote, unquote, polls, is scientifically invalid. None of these are legitimate public opinion polls. Every single one of these is a self-selection internet webpage sidebar poll. They are utter and complete nonsense. They are just for fun. These are literally toys that websites put on their website to get you to interact with them. That's all they are. They're not random. They are not scientific. They are effectively useless. Do not pay attention to these. These aren't polls. These are toys. Avoid them. Well, participate if you want, but they're not legitimate in any way. The same thing's true with Facebook likes and that nonsense. That's a type of, it's a type of self-selection process. Any self-selection process is not scientifically valid. End of story. And so this gets us to this nice graphic here shows us something about margin of error, sample size. So the idea is that you want the smallest margin of error possible. And the way you get a smaller margin of error is you get closer and closer and closer to the true population size. And so if you take a sample of 96 people, this, by the way, this goes for the sample size is and the margin of error related to sample size is a mathematical formula. the size of your population, whether you're talking about the United States of America, whether you're talking about the state of North Carolina, the city of Wilmington, or UNCW's student body. If you want a scientifically valid poll with a margin of error of something around 3 plus or minus 3%, you need at least 1,067 people in that poll. The population doesn't matter. If you want a poll of students at UNCW who support a football program, starting a football program, and I tell you that I've asked 200 students, well, that margin of error is going to be so big, it's going to be between 5% and 10%, probably like 7.5%. We'll just say that, just for example. And that way, if I tell you that 52% of students at UNCW support football programs, but a football program, but 48% do not support it, but the margin of error is 7.5%. I mean, you can just draw that. Draw two lines, put a dot at 48%, a dot at 52%, and then draw other bands 7.5% away from either side of those. What happens then is you have overlapping confidence intervals. Oh, that's my wife sending me a text message. And what happens then is that you actually can't make any judgments about what that poll means because the confidence intervals overlap. There's no statistically significant difference. And so basically what we have is a poll that tells us that people have attitudes about football programs at UNCW. That is literally what we can say about that poll. And this is often a problem you see in public opinion, particularly when it comes to media representations of public opinion. You'll see people say 52% of people love the president, 48% of people hate the president, plus or minus 4%. Well, if you draw the confidence intervals around those estimates, all of a sudden we see that poll means nothing. All we know is that some people like the president, some people don't like the president. Basically, it's a 50-50 deal. That's what it says. And that is, we need to know that information so that we know that American attitudes are mixed. But that's all we can say. We can't say anything more substantive. That is it. But that doesn't make for very good television. And so media personalities who may not really understand public opinion themselves then use this sort of bad understanding of margin of error and understanding these normal distributions, and then they take it and run with it and make sort of bad claims about public opinion. So, survey design. If you were going to design a survey, there are a few things to keep in mind. Number one, you want to think about question wording. Question wording can change people's answers in public opinion. It can change the way people understand, what the question is actually asking them. And so it's very, very important that that question wording is as straightforward and what is the best way? It should not be framed in a way that makes you more or less likely to choose an answer. And we'll look at an example of that in a minute. Sample selection is always very crucial, right? You want to make sure your sample is properly done. You want a random sample. At best is a random digit dial telephone survey sample. And you should always be aware of push polls. Push polls are not actually polls at all. These are tactics. So the best example of a push poll was in 2004. George W. Bush and John McCain were running for president in 2000, not 2004, 2000. And John McCain had sort of surprised the Bush folks and was doing very well in the primaries. And so they went down to South Carolina. It was a very tight primary. And the Bush, there's not administration at this point, but the Bush campaign was calling voters, and they would start what seemed to be a public opinion poll. The campaign was doing this. It was a tactic. They would call voters and they say, "Hello, we're calling to ask you questions about the upcoming Republican primary election. Are you a likely Republican voter?" And if you said yes, they'd go to the next question. If you said no, they'd say, "Okay, thanks a lot," and hang up. They'd say, "Are you planning to vote for John McCain or George W. Bush?" And if they said George W. Bush, they'd say, "Okay, thank you very much," and they'd hang up. If you said John McCain, they'd go to the next question. So it all sounds like a public opinion poll so far. And if you said John McCain, they'd go to the next question. And the next question was, would you be more or less likely to vote for John McCain in the upcoming Republican primary in South Carolina if you knew that he had an African American child? And people were shocked by this, right? Shocked. So there are a couple things, some backstory here. Number one is that it's 2000. The state of South Carolina was having some pretty serious issues, as usual, with race politics. The Confederate battle flag had been flying over the state capitol for 50 years as a response to desegregation, right? I mean, and so so you had this going on, and the NAACP was threatening to boycott the state until that was removed, which eventually did happen, by the way. John McCain had been a very vocal opponent of having that flag fly on the state capitol, and George W. Bush had been sort of non-committal about the whole thing. So race politics was very salient. Also, Bill Clinton as president, Bill Clinton in 1998, his affair with Monica Lewinsky had come out, and so this idea that extramarital affairs that were salient, the moral conduct of the president was a very, very salient topic at the time. So this brings two very toxic things together for John McCain. One is race politics, or the idea that John McCain, that there's some sort of untoward relationship with not just any person, but a black woman, perhaps, for John McCain. Of course, the idea that black and white people should or should not date is obviously very salient for people who have racist attitudes. And then, or rather, I should say that the idea that black and white people should not have relationships is a very salient attitude. Of course, a lot of people just don't care, because why would you? But then, of course, you have the race politics coming into it, as well as the moral issues with the presidency sort of combined together, because there have been a lot of Cindy McCain, this is John McCain's wife, there's a lot of coverage of her on the campaign trail, and it was in fact the case that John and Cindy McCain had adopted a daughter from Bangladesh, who, as a baby, as a blob of humanity, as what babies are, she has very, very darkly complected skin. And so in the United States, we don't often think about the complexions of humans around the world, but she was a baby. She had very dark skin. So one could make the assumption that the McCains were running around South Carolina holding this African-American baby, when in fact she was their adopted daughter. But that was never said in the poll. And so the reason that the Bush campaign did this was to put the seed. They didn't tell anybody. They never said, did you know John McCain has a black love child? They never said that. But it was the implication. And that was enough, some people suggest, to push George W. Bush to victory in that election. But the crucial thing to remember is that push polls are not polls at all. Not polls. No. They are, in fact, tactics used by campaigns which give polls a bad name. And then always remember the salience and environmental context. If you ask somebody on September the 5th, 2001, is terrorism an important issue for the United States to be concerned with, odds are very good that many people would have said, no, I mean, terrorism's out there, but there are other things to worry about. If you had asked people on September 15th, 2001, was terrorism a big deal? Well, of course it was, because 9/11 had just happened. I would be shocked if there's anything less than 90% on that. And so it's always salience and environmental context is always very crucial. And there are bandwagoning effects as well. This often happens around candidates. So if you see somebody being very successful, campaign on the trail, you may become more likely to support that person, or issues that were at one time taboo, which come out in the open, you may be afraid to talk about those things. But if you see it becoming popular amongst people, then you may be more likely to hold that attitude yourself. And so this brings us to question wording effects. So this is a good example. So in 2000, the United States actually had a budget surplus. So you may know that the United States right now has a deficit, we have a yearly budget deficit, but we also have a national debt of something like $19 trillion. 19 trillion with a T. Right? That's a lot. And in 2000, the budget, the national debt was much lower, I would say. And the budget deficit, which we talk about all the time, this is the fact that the government spends more money than it brings in taxes. So since 2003, we have run budget deficits every single year. And so this question was put forward to voters and people in the public in the 2000 presidential election, because the budget deficit and the budget surplus, because at that time we were bringing in more taxes than what we spent, was up for debate. So the question that pollsters were asked was, President Clinton has proposed setting aside approximately 2/3 of an expected budget surplus, this is in 2000, to fix the Social Security system. What do you think the leaders in Washington should do with the remainder of the surplus? So look, already here, the question is being worded in such a way as to suggest that some of the money will be used to fix whatever is going on with Social Security, right? That Social Security is always having actuarial issues, and so politicians always find it useful to talk about ways to fix it. So President Clinton said, hey, we got a budget surplus. We'll use some of that surplus to fix Social Security and do other things people want to do. So the first variation of possible response to this question was, should the money be used for a tax cut, or should it be used to fund new government programs? That was one way people were asked. This was an experiment, by the way. This was done to see if there were question wording differences. This was done on purpose. Then variation 2 was, should the money be used for a tax cut, so same as the first part, or should it be spent on programs for education, the environment, healthcare, crime fighting, and military defense? So if you look at these two variations, variation 1, variation 2, the situation was we had a budget surplus for the first time in many, many decades, and we were trying to think of, the public was being asked, hey, what should the U.S. government do with this surplus? Should we give a tax cut to folks, or should we spend? And so this, you'll be shocked to know that one of the biggest bones of contention between George W. Bush and Al Gore in the 2000 presidential election was what to do with the surplus. That was the biggest issue we had facing America. That was it. President Bush and Republicans wanted to do a tax cut because their argument was, if the government has a surplus, then taxes are too high. Governments should never have a surplus. Governments should spend only the money they bring in taxes. At any time you're spending less than you're bringing in taxes, that means your taxes are too high because you don't need all that money. So this is why a tax cut was out there. And Vice President Gore and President Clinton at the time were making the opposing argument. They said, listen, we have obligations, we have debts, we have other programs we want to see fulfilled, and the variations here are government programs, quote unquote, or give people specific examples of things that government programs do. So what did people say? Well, it depended very strongly on which question you got. If you got variation 1, you said, hey, let's do a tax cut because these government programs sound terrible, right? 25% of people say, let's do new programs. Nobody wants to do new government programs, quote unquote. That sounds too open-ended. That's too nebulous. Government programs are not the greatest thing. But if you gave people specific examples of things that government programs do, they're much more in favor of those opportunities to fund those programs. And so this shows you the power of question wording. And you have to be a critical consumer of information to make sure that you understand what's being asked of you. When you read a public opinion poll, and I'll show you right now, actually, let's do it right now. So I'm going to go real fast right here, close this out. So let's go to Gallup.com. So this is Gallup poll. So we'll look at, let's look at the Gallup daily tracking poll. So this is Donald Trump's job approval tracking poll from Gallup. Right now, President Trump is at 37% approval, right? That's where he is. So we want to see how we know about these polls, right? What do we know about them? We'll go to this story here from January 2017. And so if you want to know about the polls, you have to read into this stuff, right? And see how. So here it is. Here's the crucial bit here. Survey methods. Results for this Gallup poll are based on telephone interviews conducted between January 20th and 22nd, 2017 on Gallup U.S. Daily Survey with a random sample of 1,525 adults aged 18 and older living in all 50 U.S. states and the District of Columbia. Based on the results, with a total sample of national adults, the margin of error is plus or minus 3% with a 95% confidence interval, right? This is 70% cell phone, 30% landline. Now, earlier I said that Dr. King and I basically reversed this, and that's because Wilmington is the larger the population is much older. I mean, people still have landlines, so that's what the decision we made. But you have to think about these things, and it was done by range digit dial. You need to see this information for every survey that you get. Every survey that you read, you need to see this information, and you need to see the way the question was asked, right? So if you scroll back up here and look at some of this information, Gallup will tell you how they ask the questions. They'll actually let you look at it, right? And you can look at this here, US Daily Gallup, how it works. They will give you all this information. Any reputable polling firm is going to give you this information, right? And you can read all this if you want to. You can look at question wording. You can look at all of it. That's what you have to look for if you want to see what a reputable organization does. If you can't find any of this, then your poll is junk, and you should just kick it out, which is why it's very difficult. I mean, we would like to rely on media organizations and say, oh, well, they know what they're talking about. And no doubt people in the media are intelligent. They do know what they're talking about much of the time. But when it comes to something very precise and scientific like this, we want to make sure that you are knowledgeable and that you understand what you're reading. And so this is where it's on you as a citizen to be a critical consumer of information. So go back over here, do this, and just say, that's it for today. So I appreciate y'all hanging with me and watching the video. You can email me with questions. Your third discussion board is available to you. And I look forward to any questions or comments you have, and I will see you again next week.